The morning mist clung to Castle Ravencrest's stone walls, like the whispers of the dead, and Moira MacLeod felt their familiar presence as she climbed the winding stairs to the Queen's chambers. Her left arm, withered and scarred, hung uselessly at her side while her good hand carried a silver tray laden with herbs and healing oils. The other servants had long since stopped offering to help. They knew better than to acknowledge the crippled girl who moved like smoke through their world. 7 years of silence had taught her the rhythm of invisibility. She knew which stones creaked underfoot, which shadows offered the deepest concealment, and how to arrange her face into the blank mask of grateful servitude that kept questions at bay. The pack tolerated her because Luna, Queen Evangeline, had claimed her, and what the Queen wanted, the Queen received. But tolerance and acceptance were different beasts entirely. "Cursed thing," she heard Beta Marcus whisper to his companion as they passed in the corridor. "Should have been left to die in whatever hovel spawned her." Moira's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the tray, but her expression never wavered. Let them think her deaf as well as damaged. Let them believe their cruelties fell on barren ground. She had learned long ago that survival meant swallowing poison with a smile. The Queen's chambers occupied the highest tower of the castle, where morning light could stream through tall windows and chase away the shadows that seemed to follow Moira everywhere else. Here, at least, she could breathe without feeling the weight of suspicious stares. "My dear girl," Queen Evangeline's voice carried the warmth of honey and sunlight as Moira entered. The Luna sat before her vanity, silver hair cascading like moonbeams down her back. At 45, she possessed the timeless beauty of her kind, but Moira could see the subtle lines of worry that had deepened around her eyes in recent weeks. "You're earlier than usual." Moira set down the tray and began arranging the morning ritual. Oils for the Queen's hair, herbs for her tea, salves for the minor aches that even werewolf healing couldn't entirely erase. Her movements were fluid, practiced, a dance she had perfected through countless repetitions. "The others give you trouble again?" Evangeline's reflection caught Moira's eyes in the mirror. There was knowing there, a gentleness that had been Moira's salvation when she'd first stumbled half-dead from the Highland moors. A slight shake of the head. Moira had never spoken of what drove her from her past life, and Evangeline had never pressed. Some wounds were too deep for words, and both women understood the mercy of silence. "The harvest moon approaches," the Queen murmured as Moira began working the oils through her hair. "Darius grows restless. There have been disturbances in the outer territories." Moira's hands stilled for the briefest moment. She had heard whispers, rogues gathering in the deep woods, attacks on isolated farms, the kind of chaos that made even the pack's strongest warriors uneasy. But it was the mention of the Alpha King that sent ice through her veins. In 7 years of service, she had managed to avoid him almost entirely. A ghost could not afford to draw the attention of monsters, especially not the monster whose amber eyes haunted her nightmares. When she did catch glimpses of him, crossing the courtyard, addressing his warriors, ruling his domain with the casual authority of a predator, she made herself small and invisible, just another piece of castle furniture beneath his notice. "He blames himself, you know," Evangeline continued softly, "for the darkness that came before, for the choices made in ignorance and rage." The brush slipped from Moira's grip, clattering against the stone floor. As she bent to retrieve it, her sleeve rode up, revealing a glimpse of the intricate scarring that spiraled around her forearm like ancient script. The marks seemed to pulse in the morning light, as if responding to some unseen force. Evangeline's eyes sharpened. "Child!" But Moira had already tugged her sleeve back into place, her mask of serene emptiness firmly restored. Some secrets were carved too deeply into flesh and bone to ever truly heal, and some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge, even to the woman who had saved her life. Outside the tower windows, storm clouds gathered on the horizon like an omen. The harvest moon was coming, and with it, the kind of change that would shake the very foundations of the world Moira had built from the ashes of her old life. In the depths of the castle, she could feel him, the Alpha King whose blood called to something dark and ancient in her scarred flesh. He had no idea that his salvation and his destruction lived under the same roof, that the monster he had created 7 years ago now braided his mate's hair and served his table with steady, silent hands. The wheel of fate was turning, and soon there would be nowhere left to hide. The moment stretched between them like a taut bowstring, Evangeline's knowing gaze lingering on the place where Moira's sleeve had concealed the ancient marks. The Queen's fingers traced the silver brush absently, and for a heartbeat, Moira wondered if her carefully constructed world was about to crumble. Then Evangeline smiled, soft and understanding, and the spell broke. "Perhaps you could prepare my morning tea while I finish here? The chamomile blend, I think. These old bones feel the storm coming." Relief flooded through Moira as she moved to the small alcove where the Queen's personal tea service waited. Her hands shook only slightly as she measured the dried herbs. Chamomile for calm, lavender for peace, a touch of honey from the castle's own hives. Simple rituals that had anchored her to sanity when everything else had burned away. This was her world now, the quiet sanctuary of the Queen's tower, the predictable rhythm of service, the illusion of safety she had built one careful day at a time. She had learned to find purpose in the small things, the perfect temperature of bath water, the precise arrangement of Evangeline's jewels, the way morning light caught the silver threads in her mistress's hair. These details were her armor against the chaos of memory. As the tea steeped, Moira moved to the windows and began her daily task of checking the herb garden visible in the courtyard below. Evangeline grew her own healing plants, a hobby that had given Moira unexpected pleasure to tend. There was something sacred about coaxing life from earth, about nurturing green things that asked nothing more than water and sunlight to flourish. Unlike the wolves who prowled these halls, plants didn't judge her scars or whisper about curses. "The rosemary needs harvesting," she noted silently, watching a kitchen maid hurry past the garden, with her arms full of linens. Soon the morning routine would shift into its next phase, breakfast service in the great hall, where Moira would become a shadow moving between tables, pouring wine and clearing plates while the pack conducted their daily business around her. "You're thinking too loudly again, child." Evangeline had finished with her hair and now sat watching Moira with the patient attention she might give a wounded bird. "What troubles you this morning?" Everything, Moira thought. The approaching harvest moon that set her scars tingling with remembered pain. The way the Alpha King's presence seemed to press against the edges of her consciousness, even when he was nowhere to be seen. The growing certainty that her peaceful existence was as fragile as morning mist. But she couldn't voice any of that. Instead, she poured the tea with steady hands and offered it to her mistress with a slight curtsy. The Queen's eyes held questions Moira could never answer, not without unraveling the careful lies that kept them both safe. A sharp knock at the chamber door made both women freeze. "My queen?" The voice belonged to Garrett, captain of the guard, and it carried an edge of urgency that sent ice down Moira's spine. "Enter," Evangeline called, her voice carefully neutral. Garrett stepped inside, his scarred face grim beneath graying hair. He spared Moira only a glance, she was furniture after all, barely worth acknowledging, before focusing on his Luna. "Forgive the intrusion, my queen, but the Alpha King requests your presence in the war room. There's been another attack." Moira's hand tightened on the tea service, the delicate porcelain threatening to crack under her grip. Another attack meant more dead, more chaos creeping toward their borders. It meant the Alpha King would be restless, dangerous, his predator instincts heightened by the scent of threat. How many this time? Evangeline rose gracefully, already reaching for the formal circlet that marked her rank. "A farming family near Blackwater Ridge. No survivors." Garrett's expression darkened. "But this one was different, my queen. The attack pattern. It wasn't random rage. Someone directed this." The circlet slipped from Evangeline's fingers, clattering to the floor. Moira moved without thinking, scooping up the silver band and offering it back with hands that trembled only slightly. Their eyes met for an instant, and she saw her own fear reflected in the Queen's gaze. Organized rogue attacks, strategic kills, the kind of coordination that spoke of leadership, of purpose beyond simple bloodlust. Moira had seen such calculated violence before, in dreams that might have been memories, in the nightmares that still woke her screaming in the dark hours before dawn. "Tell my mate I'll join him shortly," Evangeline said, accepting the circlet back. "And Garrett? Double the guard rotations, If someone is orchestrating these attacks, understood, my queen. Garrett bowed stiffly and withdrew, leaving silence thick as smoke in his wake. Evangeline turned to Moira, her expression softer now, touched with something that might have been maternal concern. I want you to stay close to the castle today, dear one. No trips to the village, no errands beyond these walls. Moira nodded obediently, but inside, something wild and long suppressed stirred to life. The scars along her arm burned with phantom fire, and for just a moment, she remembered what it felt like to be more than a broken thing seeking shelter. She remembered being strong. The wheel was turning indeed, and Moira could feel the approaching storm in her very bones. The war room's heavy doors closed behind Evangeline, with a finality that echoed through the tower like a death knell. Moira stood frozen in the sudden silence, the queen's teacup still warm in her hands, watching steam rise from the amber liquid like incense offered to forgotten gods. Stay close to the castle. The words circled through her mind, but beneath them stirred something far more dangerous, the memory of what she had been before she became this hollow creature of service and shadow. Before the flames took everything except the scars that marked her as belonging to a world the pack had tried to erase. The teacup trembled in her grip. 7 years of carefully constructed peace, and now organized rogues stalked the borders with purpose and intelligence. The kind of methodical hunting that spoke of old grudges and older magic, the kind that had once... A crash from the courtyard below shattered her spiraling thoughts. Through the tall windows, Moira watched as a lone rider thundered through the castle gates, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Even from this height, she could see the crimson staining his clothes, smell the copper-sweet scent of blood carried on the morning wind. Another survivor. Another witness to whatever force was carving its way through the Highland territories. The messenger collapsed from his saddle before the stable hands could reach him, his body hitting the cobblestones with a sound that made Moira's scars burn. She pressed closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched Beta Marcus sprint across the courtyard, his face grim with purpose. This isn't random, she thought, her pulse quickening. This is hunting. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. She knew this pattern. The systematic elimination of isolated targets, the careful probing of defenses, the way fear was being wielded as precisely as any blade. She had seen it before, in the weeks leading up to... No. The word escaped her lips unbidden, the first sound she had made in the Queen's chambers in months. Her reflection in the window showed a stranger, wide green eyes bright with something that might have been terror or anticipation, color high in cheeks that had been pale with servitude for too long. Below, more figures emerged from the castle's depths. Warriors she recognized by silhouette and gait, moving with the fluid grace of apex predators called to hunt. And leading them, unmistakable even at this distance, came the Alpha King himself. Darius Ravencrest moved like controlled lightning, his massive frame cutting through the courtyard with purpose that made lesser wolves scatter from his path. Even from the tower's height, Moira could feel the weight of his presence, the way reality seemed to bend around him like iron drawn to a lodestone. 7 years she had avoided him. 7 years of careful timing and precise invisibility, moving through his castle like smoke while he ruled his domain in ignorance of what sheltered beneath his very roof. She had made herself nothing, no one, a broken girl grateful for scraps and shelter. But now, watching him kneel beside the wounded messenger, she felt the careful walls she had built around her memories beginning to crack. He has no idea, she thought, her scarred hand pressing flat against the cool glass. No idea that his salvation and his destruction live under the same roof. The Alpha King lifted his head, and for one impossible moment, Moira felt his gaze sweep upward toward her tower. Her breath caught in her throat, every instinct screaming at her to step back into shadow, to become nothing again. But something kept her frozen at the window, a pull she couldn't name, a recognition that hummed in her bones like struck metal. Then Beta Marcus was speaking urgently in his ear, gesturing toward the wounded man, and the moment passed. Darius's attention turned back to the crisis at hand, leaving Moira gasping as if she had been drowning. Her reflection stared back from the window. Not the hollow-eyed servant who had braided the Queen's hair an hour ago, but someone else entirely. someone whose green eyes held depths of knowledge too dangerous to examine, someone whose scars began to itch with remembered purpose. The choice crystallized before her with brutal clarity. She could retreat to the safety of routine, lose herself in the familiar rhythm of service and silence, tend to her duties, pour wine at evening meals, pretend that the storm gathering on their borders was someone else's battle to fight. Or she could remember what she had been before the flames took everything, before fear taught her to make herself small, before she learned that monsters could wear crowns. In the courtyard below, the Alpha King rose to his full height, sunlight catching the silver threads in his dark hair. His warriors gathered around him like iron filings drawn to a magnet, waiting for orders that would send them hunting through the Highland mists. Moira's scars burned with phantom fire, and deep in her chest, something that had been sleeping for 7 years began to stir. The wheel was turning, and she could feel destiny approaching like thunder on the horizon. The question was no longer whether her peaceful existence would survive the coming storm. The question was who she would choose to be when it arrived. Moira stumbled back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. The moment she broke that invisible connection with the Alpha King below, the weight of what she was contemplating crashed over her like a Highland avalanche. What am I thinking? The teacup slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the stone floor in a spray of porcelain and amber liquid. The sound seemed obscenely loud in the tower's silence, each fragment catching the morning light like tiny accusatory mirrors. She dropped to her knees among the wreckage, her good hand shaking as she gathered the broken pieces. This was what happened when she allowed herself to remember. Destruction followed as surely as night followed day. 7 years of careful invisibility, and 1 moment of weakness had her contemplating madness. The largest shard of porcelain cut her palm as she grasped it, sending a thin line of crimson across the pale ceramic. Moira stared at the blood, her blood, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Even now, even when she tried to help, she left destruction in her wake. I am not that person anymore, she told herself fiercely, pressing the wound against her skirts. That girl died in the flames. What survived is less, broken, safe. But the scars along her arm pulsed with each heartbeat, sending phantom fire racing through nerve endings that remembered a different kind of existence. They whispered of moonlit hunts and ancient oaths, of power that had once flowed through her veins like molten silver. Power that had made her family legends among their own people. Power that had also made them targets. Moira forced herself to focus on the immediate, cleaning the mess, finding a new cup, restoring order to the Queen's chambers before Evangeline returned. These small tasks had been her anchor for 7 years, the mundane rituals that kept the darkness at bay. Sweep the fragments into her apron, dab the blood from the stones, pretend her hands weren't shaking. From the courtyard below came the sound of horses' hooves striking cobblestone, the sharp commands of warriors preparing to ride. The Alpha King was mobilizing his forces, and soon they would thunder through the castle gates in pursuit of whatever evil stalked their borders. Without her, without knowing what she could tell them about organized rogue packs and the kind of coordination that turned werewolves into an army. Let them go, she thought desperately. Let them handle it. This isn't your fight anymore. But even as she tried to convince herself, memories leaked through the cracks in her carefully constructed walls. A farmhouse burning in the night. The screams of children cut brutally short. Her father's voice, steady despite the terror. Remember, Moira, we are the shield between light and darkness. We are the watchers in the night. The MacLeod clan had held their ancient duty for generations, hunting the rogues that threatened both human and werewolf communities, maintaining the delicate balance that kept their world from descending into chaos, until the night their own allies had turned against them, convinced by whispers and lies that the hunters had become the hunted, until the night Darius Ravencrest had led the attack that ended everything. Moira's vision blurred, and she realized she was crying, silent tears that carved hot tracks down her cheeks. She hadn't wept in years, had thought herself beyond such weakness. But the approaching storm was unraveling her carefully maintained control, pulling her back toward truths she couldn't afford to acknowledge. He doesn't know, she reminded herself, wiping her face with trembling fingers. He has no idea who I am, what I was. If I stay quiet, stay small, this will pass. The rogues will be dealt with or they won't, but either way, I'll survive. I always survive. But what kind of survival was it really? Hiding in shadows, serving tea to the mate of the man who had destroyed her family, watching evil gather on the borders while she possessed knowledge that might save lives. How many would die while she cowered in her tower, clinging to the illusion of safety? The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor sent panic racing through her veins. Moira shot to her feet, hastily disposing of the broken porcelain and smoothing her skirts. When Evangeline entered moments later, she found her servant standing precisely where she had left her, hands folded, expression serene. "The situation is worse than we thought," the Queen said without preamble, her face grave. "Darius is riding out within the hour. These attacks, they're not random, Moira. Someone is testing our defenses, learning our patterns." Moira nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. Inside, the war between self-preservation and duty raged like wildfire. She could feel destiny pulling at her like a riptide, threatening to drag her back into a world of violence and loss. But in the courtyard below, warriors prepared to face an enemy they didn't understand. And somewhere in the Highland mists, rogues moved with deadly purpose toward an unknown goal. The choice was hers: remain silent and safe, or remember what it meant to be MacLeod. The weight of that decision threatened to crush her. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, and in that crystalline moment, Moira MacLeod made the choice that would shatter 7 years of carefully constructed safety. "My queen." The words emerged as barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of revelation. Evangeline turned sharply, surprise flickering across her features. Moira never spoke unless directly addressed, never volunteered information or opinion. "Yes, dear one." Moira's throat felt raw, as if the very act of speech after so much silence was tearing something vital inside her. But the image of the bloodied messenger burned behind her eyes, and she could hear her father's voice echoing through the years. "We are the shield between light and darkness. The patterns you speak of." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. "I have knowledge of such things." The words hung in the air between them like an incantation, irreversible and transformative. There could be no retreat now, no return to the comforting anonymity of servitude. She had crossed an invisible threshold, and the girl who had hidden in shadows for 7 years was already becoming memory. Evangeline stepped closer, her expression shifting from surprise to something far more dangerous: hope. "What kind of knowledge, Moira?" The use of her name, spoken with such sudden intensity, sent tremors through Moira's carefully constructed defenses. For 7 years she had been dear one or child, diminutives that reinforced her position as something less than whole. But now Evangeline looked at her, as if truly seeing her for the first time. "The way they hunt," Moira said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Organized rogues don't simply kill for bloodlust. They probe defenses, eliminate witnesses, create terror to drive their prey toward predetermined killing grounds." Her scarred hand clenched into a fist. "They're hurting us." Evangeline's face went pale. "How could you possibly know?" "Because I've seen it before." The admission tore from Moira's throat like a blade. "Before I came here. Before I was this." The Queen moved closer still, and Moira caught the scent of her growing alarm, sharp and bright with understanding that something fundamental had just shifted in the world she thought she knew. "Moira, who are you?" The question she had dreaded for 7 years, the one that would unmake everything she had built from the ashes of her former life. But watching Evangeline's face, seeing the desperate hope there, Moira realized that her silence had become its own form of selfishness. How many would die because she had chosen fear over duty? "Someone who could help them," she whispered. "Someone who could tell your mate where the rogues will strike next, how they think, what they're truly after." Her voice cracked. "Someone who has no right to that knowledge, but possesses it nonetheless." Through the windows, she could hear the war party preparing to depart. Horses stamping, armor creaking, voices raised in terse command. Soon they would ride into the Highland mists, brave and doomed, hunting an enemy whose tactics they couldn't comprehend. Evangeline reached out slowly, as if approaching a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement. Her fingers brushed Moira's scarred arm, tracing the raised flesh that disappeared beneath her sleeve. "These marks, they're not from an accident, are they?" Moira's breath caught. The scars were her history written in seared flesh, a map of loss and survival that marked her as belonging to a world the pack believed extinct. "No," she said simply. "Show me." The command was gentle but implacable. Moira hesitated, then began rolling up her sleeve with trembling fingers. The scars emerged inch by terrible inch, not random burns as everyone assumed, but deliberate markings. Celtic knotwork etched in fire and pain, symbols that would be recognized by anyone versed in the old ways. The ancient battle marks of Clan MacLeod. Evangeline's sharp intake of breath filled the chamber. "Sweet goddess," she breathed. But they're all dead. Everyone knows the story they were told," Moira said quietly. "That we turned rogue, became the very thing we were sworn to hunt. That we had to be stopped before we destroyed the balance we'd protected for centuries." Her green eyes met the Queen's shocked gaze. "But the survivors always know a different truth." The sound of hoofbeats echoed from the courtyard, the war party departing, riding toward battles they might not return from. Moira felt each departing horse like a physical blow, knowing she was sending them into danger with incomplete knowledge. "I have to tell him," she said, the words seeming to come from someone else entirely. "Whatever the cost to myself, whatever happens when he learns who I am, I have to tell the Alpha King what I know." Evangeline nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current. "Yes," she said simply. "You do." Moira closed her eyes, feeling the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. When she opened them again, she was no longer a servant seeking shelter. She was MacLeod, and her exile was ending. The weight of her decision settled over Moira like a mantle of lead, and for a moment she wondered if her legs would support her. 7 years of careful invisibility, and now she was about to walk into the very heart of the storm she had spent so long avoiding. "We'll need to move quickly," Evangeline said, her Queen's mind already racing ahead to logistics. "The war party left less than an hour ago, but if we ride hard—" Moira's voice was steadier than she felt. "Not we. This burden is mine alone." She met Evangeline's sharp gaze. "And there are complications you don't understand. Things that make my presence among your warriors more dangerous than helpful." Before Evangeline could protest, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, heavy boots moving with predatory grace. Both women tensed, recognizing the distinctive rhythm. Beta Marcus appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grim with purpose. "My queen," he said, offering a curt bow before his keen eyes shifted to Moira with sudden, unsettling focus. "Forgive the intrusion, but I need to speak with your servant." The way he said the word made Moira's blood turn to ice water. There was knowledge in his tone, suspicion that cut through her disguise like a blade through silk. After 7 years of careful anonymity, somehow her moment of revelation had already begun to unravel. "Marcus," Evangeline began, moving protectively closer to Moira, "what is the meaning of—" "The wounded messenger spoke before he died," Marcus continued, his voice deadly quiet. "Strange things. Spoke of seeing someone during the attack, someone who moved wrong for a simple villager, someone who fought like they'd been trained. His pale eyes never left Moira's face. Fought like a hunter." Moira felt the walls closing in, felt the familiar panic that had kept her alive through 7 years of hiding. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear into the castle's maze of corridors and emerge somewhere else, someone else, invisible again. But the image of Darius riding into danger without crucial intelligence held her frozen in place. "I don't know what you're implying," Evangeline started. "The messenger described the fighter," Marcus interrupted. "Red hair like flame, green eyes, a woman with a crippled left arm who moved like death incarnate despite her injury. His hand drifted to the sword at his hip. Now what are the odds that such a specific description would match someone living under our very roof?" The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Moira could feel Evangeline's shock, could smell the sudden spike of fear and confusion radiating from the Queen. But beneath Marcus's suspicion, she sensed something else. Not quite hostility, but a predator's wariness when encountering something that didn't fit expected patterns. "You're wondering if I'm a threat," Moira said quietly, surprising herself with her calm. "If I'm some kind of spy or assassin who's been living in your midst all these years." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Are you?" "No." The word carried absolute conviction. "But I am something else. Something that might be equally dangerous to your pack's peace of mind." She could feel the moment crystallizing around her, destiny closing like a trap she had set for herself. There would be no half measures now, no careful revelations parceled out to maintain illusions. The truth was demanding its due. "The rogues attacking your borders," she continued. "They're not random killers. They're organized, disciplined, following tactics that haven't been seen for decades. They're testing your defenses because they're planning something larger, something that will require them to know exactly how your forces respond to threats." "How could you possibly?" Marcus began. "Because I've fought organized rogue packs before." The admission hung in the air like a death knell. "Because I was trained to hunt them, trained by people who understood their methods better than anyone alive." Understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like recognition. His hand tightened on his sword hilt. The old stories speak of hunters who worked in the shadows. Clan MacLeod. Evangeline gasped, pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. But Marcus's expression had shifted from suspicion to something far more complex, fear warring with desperate hope. "They say MacLeod died out decades ago," he said carefully. "Wiped out to the last soul. They say many things." Moira's voice carried the weight of old grief, old rage carefully banked but never extinguished. "Most of them lies told to justify necessary evils." "Prove it," Marcus commanded. "If you're truly what you claim, prove it." Moira met his challenge with steady green eyes. "Give me a map of the attacks. Give me an hour to study the patterns. Then ask me where they'll strike next." Her scarred hand clenched into a fist. "Ask me how to hunt the hunters." The beta's expression shifted, predator recognizing predator across the space between them. Whatever test this was, whatever judgment was forming behind his pale eyes, Moira sensed she was walking a razor's edge between salvation and destruction. "1 hour," he said finally. "Then we ride hard to catch the Alpha King before he walks into whatever trap is waiting." Moira nodded, feeling the last of her peaceful existence crumble into memory. The hunter was awakening, and there would be no going back. Marcus led them to the war room with swift, purposeful strides, his hand never straying far from his sword hilt. The circular chamber felt oppressive in the torchlight, shadows dancing across ancient stones as if the very walls remembered older, bloodier times. Maps covered the massive oak table, detailed renderings of the Highland territories marked with red ink that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Here," Marcus said tersely, pointing to the scattered crimson marks. 7 attacks in 3 weeks. 4 farms, 2 hunting parties, 1 merchant caravan. No survivors except that boy, and he died before we could learn much." Moira approached the table slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scarred flesh of her left arm burned beneath her sleeve, responding to proximity with familiar violence. 7 years of suppressed instincts roared to life as her eyes swept across the tactical display, recognizing patterns that would be invisible to those who hadn't been raised to think like their prey. "You've been thinking like wolves," she said quietly, her finger tracing the attack sites. "Pack hunters who strike and withdraw. But this," she gestured at the seemingly random distribution of marks, "this is human thinking imposed on werewolf capabilities." Evangeline moved closer, her scent sharp with anxiety. "What do you mean?" "Look at the timing." Moira's voice grew stronger as muscle memory reasserted itself, years of training overriding terror. Not the dates of the attacks, but the intervals between them. 3 days, then 5, then 2, then 4. "It seems random, but..." She pulled a quill from the map case, quickly sketching lines between the attack sites. "They're giving each location exactly enough time to send word to Castle Ravencrest and receive a response." Marcus leaned forward, his weathered face intent. "They're watching our patrol routes." "More than that." Moira's finger stabbed at a cluster of attacks near the eastern border. They're timing their strikes to draw your forces in specific directions. Each attack pulls warriors away from particular areas, creating gaps in coverage that... She trailed off, her blood turning to ice as the full pattern revealed itself. "What?" Evangeline demanded. "What do you see?" Moira's hand trembled as she traced a final line across the map. When the connections were complete, they formed a rough but unmistakable shape. A funnel, with all the attack sites designed to drive Ravencrest forces toward a single point deep in the mist-shrouded valleys. "It's a trap," she breathed. "All of this, the raids, the terror, the seemingly random violence, it's been herding your warriors toward predetermined killing ground." Marcus cursed viciously. "The Alpha King rode out 2 hours ago with our fastest riders, following the trail from the latest attack." "Which direction?" Moira asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Southeast, toward Widow's Glen." The name hit her like a physical blow. Widow's Glen, a narrow valley surrounded by high cliffs, with limited escape routes and perfect sightlines for archers. Her father had used it once to trap a rogue pack, back when she was still young enough to believe the world made sense. "How many men?" she asked, her voice barely audible. 20 of our best," Marcus replied. "Why? What's special about—" "It's a kill box." The words emerged as a whisper of pure horror. Narrow approach, high ground on both sides, only one way out. If they're waiting there with sufficient numbers... She couldn't finish the thought. Evangeline's face had gone ashen. How long would it take to reach them? On foot? Too long. Marcus was already moving toward the armor rack. On horseback, pushing hard? Maybe 3 hours if we don't spare the horses. "We?" Moira asked. The beta's pale eyes glinted with something that might have been respect. "You think I'm letting the last MacLeod ride into danger without backup? If half the stories are true, you're worth a dozen ordinary warriors." Fear clawed at Moira's throat. The thought of leaving the castle's protective walls, of exposing herself to the world that had tried so hard to destroy her, sent panic racing through her veins. But the alternative, Darius and his warriors walking blindly into slaughter, was unbearable. "I'll need weapons," she said quietly. "And armor that won't restrict my left arm." Marcus nodded grimly. "What else?" Moira closed her eyes, feeling the last vestiges of her peaceful existence slip away like smoke. When she opened them again, something fundamental had changed in her bearing. The invisible weight of command settling across shoulders that had carried only servitude for 7 years. "Pray to whatever gods still listen," she said, her voice carrying echoes of ancient authority. "Because tonight, the dead hunt again." Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind carried the scent of approaching rain, or blood. The armory felt like a tomb awakening as Moira crossed its threshold for the first time in 7 years. Ancient weapons lined the walls like silent sentinels, their steel surfaces gleaming with deadly promise in the torchlight. Her left arm throbbed with phantom pain as memory surged unbidden, her father's hands guiding her grip, her mother's voice correcting her stance. The weight of expectation that came with bearing the MacLeod name. "Take what you need," Marcus said gruffly, but his eyes tracked her movements with predatory attention. Moira moved through the arsenal like a woman possessed, her scarred fingers testing blade weights and checking balance points with instinctive precision. The servant's calluses on her palms felt alien against weapon hilts, 7 years of domestic labor at war with older muscle memories. A silver-inlaid dirk called to her, not for its beauty, but for the way it sang when drawn from its sheath. "Interesting choice," Marcus observed as she secured the blade at her hip. "Most would reach for a sword." "Most haven't learned to fight with a crippled arm," Moira replied, testing the draw. The motion was clumsy, uncertain, rust flaking from skills she'd once wielded with lethal grace. Close work requires different tools. The leather armor Marcus provided was supple and dark, designed for rangers who valued silence over protection. As Moira struggled with the buckles, her trembling hands betrayed the magnitude of what she was attempting. Evangeline appeared at her side without invitation, nimble fingers working the straps with gentle efficiency. "You don't have to do this," the queen murmured, her voice pitched for Moira's ears alone. We could send ravens to the other clans, gather forces. There's no time. Moira's voice cracked like winter ice. By the time help arrives, Darius will be dead. They all will. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Evangeline's hands stilled on the armor clasps, and when she spoke again, her tone carried dangerous understanding. You care for him. For my mate. It wasn't a question. Moira closed her eyes, unable to deny what 7 years of careful observation had burned into her heart. She had watched Darius from the shadows, seen his kindness toward the castle's children, his fierce protection of those under his care, the way grief sometimes darkened his eyes when he thought no one was looking. She had fallen in love with a man who would destroy her if he knew what she truly was. It doesn't matter, she whispered. Nothing matters except keeping him alive. Marcus appeared beside them, armed and ready, his weathered face grim with purpose. The horses are saddled. But understand this. If you're lying, if this is some elaborate deception, I'll cut you down myself. Moira met his stare without flinching. If I'm lying, you won't need to. The rogues will do it for you. They mounted in the courtyard as storm clouds gathered overhead, the wind carrying scents of approaching violence. Moira's mare sensed her rider's tension, dancing sideways with nervous energy that matched her own hammering pulse. 7 years since she'd sat a horse. 7 years since she'd ridden toward battle instead of fleeing from it. Which route? Marcus demanded as they cleared the castle gates. Moira studied the darkening sky, calculating distances and terrain with skills she'd prayed never to need again. The old shepherd's track through Brennan's Pass. It's treacherous, but it cuts 2 hours off the journey. That path hasn't been used in decades, Marcus protested. It's barely more than a goat track now. Then they won't expect it. Moira urged her mount forward, muscle memory guiding her into the rhythm of hard riding. MacLeods know every hidden way through these mountains. Some advantages endure. They rode hard, through gathering darkness, their horses' hooves striking sparks from ancient stone. The familiar landscape blurred past, peaks and valleys that had sheltered her ancestors for centuries, now witness to her desperate gamble. With each mile, Moira felt her carefully constructed identity falling away like shed skin, revealing something harder and more dangerous beneath. The greatest fear she'd carried for 7 years wasn't discovery or death. It was this moment, when she would stop running and turn to face the world that had tried to break her. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to preserve the fragile safety she'd built from ashes and anonymity. But Darius's face haunted her thoughts, along with the 20 warriors who trusted their Alpha King to lead them home. Behind them, Castle Ravencrest disappeared into mist and memory. Ahead lay Widow's Glen and whatever trap awaited there. As lightning split the sky and thunder rolled across the Highland peaks, Moira MacLeod rode toward her destiny with death as her companion and love as her guiding star. The last daughter of a murdered clan was going to war, and the world would never be the same. The shepherd's track through Brennan's Pass proved every bit as treacherous as Marcus had warned. What had once been a reliable mountain route had deteriorated into a nightmare of loose scree and crumbling ledges, made infinitely worse by the storm that lashed them with icy rain and howling wind. Moira's mare stumbled twice on the narrow path, hooves skittering dangerously close to drops that vanished into black nothingness. We should have taken the main road, Marcus shouted over the wind, his words barely audible above the thunder that rolled endlessly through the peaks. Moira didn't waste breath on a reply. Every instinct she possessed screamed that they were already too late, that while they fought their way through this mountain maze, Darius and his warriors were walking into carefully prepared slaughter. The familiar weight of the dirk at her hip felt simultaneously foreign and natural. 7 years of disuse warring with skills burned into bone and sinew. When they finally descended into the valley approach to Widow's Glen, the storm's fury had reached its peak. Rain turned the ancient track into a river of mud that sucked at their horses' hooves and sent cascades of stone rattling into the darkness below. But it was the smell that made Moira's blood freeze. The metallic tang of spilled blood carried on the wind, mixed with smoke, and something else that triggered memories she'd spent years trying to bury. "We're too late," she whispered, the words torn away by wind that seemed to mock her desperate gamble. They found the first body 100 yards from the glen's mouth. One of Darius's scouts, sprawled face down in the mud with arrows sprouting from his back like deadly flowers. The rain had washed most of the blood away, but the corpse was still warm. Death was fresh here, violent and recent. Marcus dismounted with predatory grace, examining the scene with professional detachment. 3 arrows. Crossbow bolts, not hunting shafts. He looked up at the surrounding cliffs, pale eyes calculating angles and distances. Coordinated fire from multiple positions. Moira slid from her mare's back, her legs nearly buckling as 7 years of suppressed trauma crashed over her like a tide. The familiar ritual of examining battlefield casualties, the cold assessment of tactical situations, it all came flooding back with nauseating clarity. She was 15 again, following her father through the aftermath of a rogue pack's rampage, learning to read death like scripture. "How many shooters?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "At least 6, maybe more." Marcus straightened, water streaming from his grizzled beard. "Professional work? Military precision." They pressed forward into the glen itself, and Moira's worst fears crystallized into horrific reality. The narrow valley floor was littered with bodies. Ravencrest warriors cut down in what had clearly been a perfectly orchestrated ambush. The high cliffs on either side showed the dark mouths of concealed positions where archers had waited with patient malice. But it was the absence that struck her like a physical blow. 20 warriors had ridden out with their Alpha King. She counted 17 corpses. "Where is he?" The question emerged as a broken whisper. "Where's Darius?" Marcus was already moving among the fallen, checking faces with grim efficiency. "Here's Captain Reynolds, Sergeant MacBain, most of the escort." His voice carried professional control, but Moira heard the tremor beneath. No sign of the Alpha King or 2 of his personal guard. Hope flared in her chest, brief, desperate, quickly crushed by tactical reality. If Darius lived, it meant he'd been taken. And there were fates far worse than a clean death on the battlefield. They needed him alive, she realized, the words tasting like ashes. This whole elaborate setup, the herding tactics, the precision ambush, it was never about killing him. It was about capture. Lightning split the sky as if responding to her horror, illuminating the glen in stark white relief. For one terrible moment, she saw it all clearly. The careful positioning of bodies, the deliberate arrangement designed to send a message. This hadn't been simply military efficiency. This had been theater. "Look at the wounds," she said, approaching one of the fallen warriors. "Clean kills, professional shots. But arranged afterward. Positioned to tell a story." Marcus followed her gaze, understanding dawning in his weathered features. Psychological warfare. They want us to know exactly how helpless we were. More than that. Moira's scarred hand traced the air above the corpse, reading the scene like a hunter's map. They want us to follow. This is another funnel, another trap. They took Darius somewhere they expect us to pursue them. The full magnitude of their failure crashed over her like a collapsing mountain. Her desperate gambit, her carefully analyzed intelligence, her return to weapons and warfare, all of it useless. Worse than useless because now she stood in a charnel house of her own making, surrounded by the consequences of choices that had led only to death and capture. Thunder rolled across the glen like the laughter of malevolent gods, and Moira MacLeod fell to her knees in the mud, finally understanding that some hunts were designed to destroy the hunter. The revelation. The rain hammered against Moira's bent shoulders as she knelt among the dead, but it was the silence between thunderclaps that threatened to destroy her. A silence filled with the weight of 17 lives lost to her miscalculation. Her scarred fingers pressed into the mud, seeking some anchor against the vertigo of complete failure. "Get up." Marcus's voice cut through her despair like a blade. "Grief is a luxury we can't afford. Not while he's still alive." Moira lifted her head, rain streaming down her face like tears she refused to shed. Alive for how long? And for what purpose? The questions emerged raw, stripped of the careful control she'd maintained for 7 years. "I led us into their trap, just like they wanted. I read their signs and followed their breadcrumbs like a trained dog." "You're thinking like prey again," Marcus said harshly, circling her with predatory intensity. Like a servant, not a hunter. The MacLeod I've heard stories about wouldn't surrender after one setback. The name hit her like a physical blow, shattering something fundamental inside her chest. For 7 years she'd been Moira the servant, Moira the invisible, Moira the broken. But standing in this valley of death, surrounded by the consequences of her choices, the careful barriers she'd built around her identity began to crumble. The MacLeod, she repeated, tasting the title like poison. Do you know what that really means? What being the last MacLeod actually cost? Lightning illuminated the glen again, and in that stark white moment, memories she'd buried beneath years of servitude erupted with volcanic force. She saw her father's face as the flames took him, not afraid, but proud that his daughter had escaped. Her mother's final scream cut short by smoke and steel. The weight of her baby brother in her arms as she ran through burning corridors, his tiny heart beating against her chest until it didn't. It means everyone I ever loved died because of who I am, she whispered, her voice breaking like ice in spring. It means I've been running from my own shadow for 7 years, trying to pretend I could be something other than what I was born to be. Marcus knelt beside her in the mud, his weathered face surprisingly gentle. And what were you born to be? The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding an answer she'd refused to give herself. Around them, the dead bore silent witness to the failure of half measures and careful deceptions. Darius was gone, captured, tortured, possibly dead, because she'd tried to be both hunter and servant, warrior and invisible girl. A weapon, she said finally, the admission torn from the deepest part of her soul. I was born to be a weapon against the darkness. Forged in fire, tempered by loss, sharpened by necessity. She looked up at Marcus, and for the first time in 7 years, her eyes held no trace of submission. The MacLeods were never just hunters. We were the blade held at the throat of chaos, the line that monsters couldn't cross. Thunder crashed overhead, but Moira no longer flinched. Instead, she rose slowly to her feet, mud streaming from her knees as something ancient and implacable awakened in her bearing. The careful posture of servitude fell away like discarded rags, revealing the predatory grace that had been her birthright. They think they've won, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. They think capturing one king will break our resolve, that slaughtering good warriors will send us fleeing in terror. She turned to survey the battlefield, but now her gaze held the cold calculation of a tactician, rather than the horror of a survivor. They don't understand what they've actually done. Which is? Marcus asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew. Moira drew the silver-inlaid dirk from her hip, testing its balance with movements that flowed, like water, despite 7 years of disuse. The blade caught lightning and threw it back in brilliant flashes, as if the metal itself hungered for what was to come. They've reminded me who I really am, she said simply. Not Moira the servant, grateful for scraps and shadows. Not the broken girl who fled burning halls and buried her name in anonymity. The weapon spun in her grip, once, twice, settling into position with the certainty of a key finding its lock. They've awakened Moira MacLeod, last daughter of the Hunter clan, heir to techniques that predate their oldest nightmares. The transformation was complete now, visible in every line of her body. Where moments before had knelt a shattered woman drowning in self-recrimination, now stood something far more dangerous, a predator that had finally stopped pretending to be prey. The trail they left is deliberate, she continued, studying the muddy ground with eyes that missed nothing. They want us to follow, want us desperate and reckless. But they've made one crucial mistake. What's that? Moira smiled for the first time since leaving Castle Ravencrest, and the expression held no warmth at all, only the terrible promise of retribution. They think they're hunting sheep, she said, sheathing the dirk with fluid grace. They're about to learn what happens when you corner a wolf. Marcus studied the transformed woman before him, recognizing something in her bearing that spoke to the soldier's soul within him. The broken servant who had knelt in the mud moments before was gone, replaced by something altogether more dangerous and more useful. What do you need? He asked simply. Moira moved through the battlefield with new purpose, examining each fallen warrior not with grief, but with the clinical assessment of a strategist. Information first. They left 17 bodies, but took 3 prisoners. That tells us about their resources and intentions. She knelt beside Captain Reynolds, noting the precise placement of his wounds. Professional killers would have ensured clean deaths for everyone, but they needed intelligence, which means interrogation. The implications hung heavy between them. Marcus watched her work, impressed despite himself by the methodical way she reconstructed the ambush. 7 years of dormancy hadn't dulled her tactical mind. If anything, the forced hibernation had sharpened her focus to a razor's edge. The positioning suggests they had advance warning of the route, she continued, tracing sightlines from the cliff positions. Someone with intimate knowledge of Ravencrest protocols provided intelligence. This wasn't opportunistic. It was planned, coordinated, executed by professionals with significant resources. Thunder rolled overhead as Moira moved to examine the drag marks where Darius and his remaining guards had been hauled away. The trail was obvious, too obvious for Marcus's comfort. Deep ruts in the muddy ground pointed toward the eastern passes, as clear as painted signs. "They want us to follow," he observed. "Of course they do." Moira's scarred fingers traced the wheel marks, reading stories written in mud and stone. "But they're making assumptions about who will be doing the following." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with something that might have been anticipation. "They expect pursuit from Castle Ravencrest. Traditional forces following traditional tactics. Heavy cavalry, siege equipment, everything loud and obvious and slow." Understanding began to dawn in Marcus's weathered features. "You're not planning traditional pursuit. The MacLeods didn't survive 3 centuries of clan warfare by fighting fair battles." Moira straightened, her transformation now complete in both posture and purpose. "We survived by being what our enemies couldn't predict or prepare for, by striking where they felt safe and vanishing before they could respond." She moved to her mare, checking equipment with the efficiency of someone born to campaign life. The leather armor that had felt foreign an hour before now seemed like a second skin, and the dirk at her hip rested with the familiarity of an old friend. "I need to send word back to Evangeline," she said, pulling parchment and charcoal from her saddlebags. "She'll be expecting a traditional rescue, mounted warriors charging to the rescue like something from a bard's tale. Instead, she needs to play a different role." Marcus watched her compose the message with quick, decisive strokes. "What kind of role?" "The grieving Luna Queen, desperate for her mate's return. Public enough that word reaches our enemies' ears." Moira sealed the letter, handing it to Marcus. She needs to be seen preparing a massive rescue force, gathering clan allies, calling in favors, making a great show of traditional military might. A distraction, Marcus realized. "While you do what, exactly?" Moira swung into her saddle with fluid grace, the movement so natural it seemed she'd never left it. What MacLeods have always done best: hunt alone, strike without warning, and leave no survivors to report our methods. She gathered her reins, her mare sensing the change in her rider, and responding with eager anticipation. "They took my king. They slaughtered good warriors. They made the mistake of thinking 7 years had made me weak." Lightning split the sky again, illuminating her face in stark relief. Marcus saw no trace of the broken servant who had fled Castle Ravencrest hours before. This was something primal and deadly, a predator that had finally acknowledged its true nature. "Send the message," she commanded, her voice carrying authority that made him straighten instinctively. "Tell Evangeline to make a great show of preparation, enough noise to draw every enemy eye. But also tell her this: the MacLeod rides again, and this hunt ends with blood." She wheeled her mount toward the eastern trail, pausing only long enough to offer one final instruction. "Give me 3 days before the Queen's forces move. 3 days to do what civilized armies cannot." Marcus watched her disappear into the storm-lashed darkness, carrying with her the promise of violence older and more terrible than anything their enemies could imagine. The rain continued to fall on the Glen's 17 dead, washing their blood into soil that had seen too much death already. But for the first time since discovering the ambush site, Marcus found himself smiling. The rogues had wanted to provoke a response from Castle Ravencrest, and they would certainly get one. Just not the response they expected. They had awakened something that should have stayed sleeping, and now they would face the consequences of that choice. The eastern trail bit into the mountainside like a knife wound, carved from stone and desperation by countless generations of warriors who had needed swift passage through hostile territory. Moira's mare picked her way along the treacherous path with sure-footed precision, reading the terrain through hooves that found purchase on rain-slicked rock, while her rider's mind raced ahead to the killing ground she was certain waited in the darkness. She had ridden this route before, not as herself, but in the memories inherited from her father's teachings and her grandfather's war stories. Every MacLeod learned these paths, these secret ways through the mountains that enemies never discovered until it was too late. The knowledge sang in her blood now, awakened after 7 years of enforced dormancy. The storm was breaking, lightning growing more distant and thunder fading to occasional grumbles, but the rain continued its relentless assault. Good. Weather would mask her approach, muffle sounds, wash away scent trails. The elements that had revealed her failure in the glen would now serve her purposes as she became what she should have been from the beginning. A hunter in her natural environment. Her scarred left arm ached with the cold, the damaged muscles protesting the unaccustomed strain of combat readiness. But pain was an old companion, familiar as breathing after 7 years of hiding her limitations behind servants' tasks. The difference now was that she no longer saw the injury as weakness to be concealed. It was simply another tool to be employed, another weapon in an arsenal her enemies couldn't possibly understand. They would expect pursuit, yes, but they would expect it to come from behind, from the direction of Castle Ravencrest and traditional military response. They would have watchers on the obvious approaches, guards posted at the predictable choke points. What they wouldn't anticipate was a single rider taking the old paths, the forgotten ways that existed only in clan memory and passed down through bloodlines they thought extinct. Moira guided her mount off the main trail, onto what appeared to be nothing more than a deer track winding upward through dense pine. But her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, describing this exact route during long winter nights, when stories were the only weapons available against despair. The Raven's Road, he had called it. When you need to strike from where eagles dare not nest. The path climbed steeply, switchbacking through terrain that would challenge mountain goats. Her mare labored now, breath steaming in the cold air, but pressed on with the determination of a creature bred for exactly this kind of work. MacLeod horses were selected for endurance and courage as much as speed, trained from birth to carry warriors through impossible country toward necessary violence. As they climbed, Moira felt the last vestiges of her servant's identity sloughing away like shed skin. The careful deference, the studied invisibility, the constant awareness of her place in Castle Ravencrest's hierarchy, all of it dissolved in the familiar rhythm of hunter and hunted. She was becoming herself again, and the transformation was both terrifying and inevitable. The memories came flooding back now, no longer suppressed by the desperate need to remain hidden. Her father teaching her to read tracks in snow, to move through forest without disturbing a single leaf. Her mother's lessons in herb lore, in poisons that killed silently, and salves that healed wounds that should have been fatal. The old stories of MacLeod victories won not through force of arms, but through cunning, patience, and the willingness to do what civilized warriors could not. 3 days. She had given herself 3 days to accomplish what traditional forces would attempt with hundreds of soldiers and siege equipment. 3 days to infiltrate their stronghold, locate Darius, and extract him before torture broke his mind, or enemies tired of keeping him alive. 3 days to prove that 7 years of hiding hadn't destroyed the predator her bloodline had spent centuries creating. The trail leveled out onto a narrow ridge that offered glimpses of the valleys below. Through breaks in the clouds, Moira could see distant lights, campfires that marked her enemy's passage. They were moving slowly, burdened by prisoners and confident in their success. That confidence would be their weakness. She dismounted long enough to study the terrain through her father's spyglass, inherited from his sword belt and carried through 7 years of servitude, like a talisman of better times. The magnification revealed details that confirmed her tactical assessment. A professional force, well-equipped and disciplined, but following predictable patterns because they believed themselves safe. They had taken Darius to hurt Evangeline, to force political concessions or territorial surrender. But they had also taken him because they feared what he represented, the unity between supernatural clans that their chaos could not touch. They would keep him alive long enough to extract maximum advantage from his capture. That calculation bought her time, but it also raised stakes she couldn't afford to consider too closely. Darius might be suffering at this very moment, enduring pain meant to break his spirit before they broke his body. The thought threatened to overwhelm her newfound focus with rage that would make her careless. She forced herself back into the saddle, back onto the path that led toward violence and resolution. Personal feelings were luxuries she couldn't afford. The MacLeod rode to war, and war demanded nothing less than absolute commitment. The Raven's road ended at a precipice that dropped away into darkness, the ancient path concluding at what appeared to be certain death. But Moira's inherited memories guided her to a series of handholds carved into the rock face, footholds that her ancestors had used to descend into enemy territory when conventional approaches meant suicide. She secured her mare in a sheltered hollow, whispering promises of return that she wasn't certain she could keep. The horse would wait. MacLeod mounts were trained for this, bred for the loyalty that meant survival in clan warfare. If she failed to return by dawn, the mare would find her own way back to Castle Ravencrest, carrying news of another MacLeod lost to darkness. The descent tested every skill her father had drilled into her during childhood training sessions that had seemed like games, hand over hand, finding purchase on stone slick with rain and worn smooth by centuries of wind. Her scarred left arm screamed protest, the damaged muscles threatening to give way with each careful movement. But she had learned to work with limitations, to compensate for weakness by becoming stronger everywhere else. Halfway down the cliff face, she paused to survey the valley spread below. The enemy camp sprawled across a natural clearing, too large, too visible, too confident. They had numbers enough to feel secure, discipline enough to maintain proper watches, but they lacked the paranoid caution that came from facing supernatural predators who hunted by different rules. Through her spyglass she counted 30 warriors, professional soldiers armed and armored for serious warfare. But more telling was what she didn't see, the careful positioning that suggested knowledge of MacLeod tactics, the silver-blessed weapons that could kill supernatural enemies, the ward stones that would prevent certain forms of magical approach. They knew enough to capture a werewolf king, but not enough to guard against a threat they believed extinct. That ignorance would cost them everything. Moira completed her descent as the storm finally exhausted itself, leaving behind the crystalline clarity that followed mountain tempests. Stars emerged between racing clouds, providing just enough light to navigate by while maintaining the shadows she needed for concealment. The camp's perimeter was professionally maintained, sentries at predictable intervals, clear sightlines, overlap zones that prevented obvious infiltration routes. But professional soldiers thought in terms of armies, of forces that moved with banners and formations. They weren't prepared for a single infiltrator who had learned stealth from a bloodline that had perfected it across 3 centuries of clan warfare. She studied the guard rotations for an hour, timing their patterns and identifying the brief windows when attention focused elsewhere. The sentries were competent, but not supernatural, human warriors whose senses operated within normal parameters. They wouldn't detect her approach unless she made obvious mistakes, and MacLeods were trained never to make obvious mistakes. Movement in the camp center drew her attention to a cluster of larger tents that suggested command structure. Through her spyglass she glimpsed figures moving between the canvas shelters, leaders discussing strategy or prisoners being moved for interrogation. Darius would be there, in the heart of their stronghold, where they felt most secure. The irony wasn't lost on her. They had brought him to the place they considered safest, never realizing they were positioning him exactly where a MacLeod infiltrator could reach him most easily. Central locations meant multiple escape routes, and multiple escape routes meant options when violence erupted. Moira began her approach during the darkest hour before dawn, when human alertness reached its natural ebb. She moved through shadows like liquid darkness, each step planned and executed with the precision her father had demanded during training sessions, that had left her exhausted, but perfectly prepared for nights exactly like this. The camp's edges held the expected detritus of military life, Supply wagons, horse lines, latrine trenches. But among the mundane equipment, she spotted details that confirmed her earlier assessment of enemy capabilities. Quality weapons, professional organization, resources that suggested backing from someone with substantial wealth and influence. This wasn't a simple rogue attack. Someone had invested serious money in capturing Darius, which meant someone with political ambitions that required his removal from the equation. The knowledge changed nothing about her immediate objectives, but added layers of complexity she would need to address after completing the extraction. A sentry passed within arm's reach, his attention focused on the perimeter, rather than the shadows beside a supply wagon where death crouched in human form. Moira let him pass unmolested. Killing him would create alarm, and alarm would complicate everything that followed. Better to remain a ghost, until ghosting no longer served her purposes. The command area lay 50 yards ahead, protected by additional guards and better lighting. But between her position and that objective stretched terrain, perfectly suited to MacLeod infiltration techniques, scattered equipment, canvas walls that provided concealment, and human enemies whose senses couldn't pierce supernatural stealth. She drew her silver-inlaid dirk, testing its balance one final time. Everything she had learned, everything she had inherited, everything 7 years of suppressed identity had forged within her, all of it converged on this moment when the last MacLeod finally stopped hiding and became what she was born to be. The final test had begun. The first guard died without a sound, Moira's silver dirk finding the gap between helmet and gorget with surgical precision. She caught his falling body, lowering it behind supply crates, where it would remain undiscovered until dawn revealed too many failures for concealment. 20 yards to the command tent. She could see torchlight through canvas walls, shadows moving within that spoke of activity despite the hour. Good. Distracted enemies made careless mistakes, and she needed every advantage their overconfidence could provide. The second sentry fell to a stranglehold that cut off air before he could cry warning, her scarred arm proving stronger than it appeared when necessity demanded impossible things. MacLeod training had taught her to kill efficiently, without waste or hesitation, and the skills returned as naturally as breathing. 15 yards. She could hear voices now, low, urgent conversation that carried the authority of command decisions. Through a gap in the tent flap, she glimpsed figures bent over what appeared to be maps or documents, planning their next move perhaps, discussing terms for prisoner exchange. None of them imagining that death crouched so close their own breath could have warmed it. But it was the scent that stopped her cold. Blood, fresh and familiar, carrying undertones that made her supernatural senses scream recognition. Darius. Wounded, probably tortured, but alive enough to bleed. The knowledge sent rage coursing through her veins like molten silver, threatening to overwhelm the careful control that kept her invisible. She forced herself to remain motionless, to let the fury burn through her system until only cold purpose remained. Emotion was luxury. Emotion got hunters killed when they needed precision most. The MacLeod bloodline had survived by learning when to feel and when to simply act. 10 yards, close enough to distinguish individual voices, to understand that they were indeed discussing their prisoner's condition. One speaker, educated accent, authority that suggested leadership, was expressing concern about their captive's resilience under interrogation. "He's stronger than anticipated," the voice said, frustration evident despite attempts at professional control. "Traditional methods aren't yielding the information we need." "Then we escalate," replied another, this one rougher, more direct. "Everyone breaks eventually. It's simply a matter of finding the right pressure points." Moira's grip tightened on her dirk until silver-inlaid steel threatened to bite her palm. They were discussing torture with the casual efficiency of craftsmen evaluating tools. Speaking of Darius, as if he were nothing more than a problem requiring solution through applied violence. 5 yards. She could see the command tent's rear wall now, noting the way canvas pulled tight against supporting stakes. A single cut would create entry point, but entry meant commitment to violence that couldn't be contained or controlled once unleashed. Through the fabric, she glimpsed a larger shadow that didn't move with the others, someone sitting or restrained rather than pacing with command authority. Her enhanced hearing caught the subtle sound of labored breathing, of someone maintaining consciousness through pain that should have brought unconsciousness. Darius, alive, aware, enduring whatever they had done to him with the stubborn resilience that had made him worthy of a crown. The knowledge crystallized her purpose with absolute clarity. She had come to extract a prisoner, but she was about to do something far more primal. She was about to kill the people who had dared harm what belonged to her, and the distinction mattered in ways that transformed tactical necessity into personal warfare. Her scarred left hand found the canvas, testing its tension while her right prepared the dirk for killing work. The silver inlay caught starlight, gleaming with promise of violence that would end careers built on other people's suffering. Behind her, she heard boots approaching, another sentry completing his rounds, following patterns that would bring him past the supply area, where his dead comrade waited for discovery. Time was collapsing into moments that would determine whether this extraction succeeded or became another MacLeod failure written in blood. She drew her second blade, a Sciandu inherited from her mother, smaller than the dirk but equally deadly in trained hands. 2 weapons for multiple targets, because the tent held at least 3 voices and possibly more enemies, positioned beyond her current sightlines. The approaching footsteps were 20 seconds away from discovering the first corpse. 20 seconds before alarms spread through the camp like wildfire, bringing overwhelming numbers to bear against a single infiltrator who would then face the choice between impossible flight or glorious last stand. Unless she acted first. Unless the MacLeod bloodline proved itself worthy of the legends that had kept her enemies awake during long winter nights when clan warfare was decided by individual courage rather than army strength. Moira pressed silver steel against canvas, feeling the fabric part like willing flesh. Through the growing gap, she could see Darius bound to a chair, blood staining his shirt but his eyes alert and furious. Around him, 3 figures in expensive armor discussed his fate, with a detachment of merchants negotiating livestock prices. She smiled, recognizing the expression from childhood mirrors when her father had taught her that some enemies deserved death more than others. The final hunt began now. The tent erupted in controlled violence as Moira flowed through the canvas gap like liquid death, her inherited weapons finding throats before minds could process the impossibility of her presence. The first armored figure fell with silver steel buried between vertebrae, his expensive equipment useless against MacLeod precision that had been perfected across 3 centuries of clan warfare. The second managed to draw breath for warning before her Sciandu silenced him permanently, the smaller blade proving equally effective at ending conversations that had grown too comfortable with cruelty. Blood sprayed across campaign maps that would never guide another expedition, staining territorial ambitions with the reality of miscalculation. But the third, the leader whose educated accent had discussed torture with such clinical detachment, proved faster than his subordinates. His blade cleared its sheath in time to deflect her killing strike, sending sparks cascading as silver met steel in the confined space between command table and prisoner. Impossible, he breathed, eyes widening as recognition dawned. The MacLeods are extinct. Almost, Moira replied, her dirk weaving patterns that forced him backward toward the tent's entrance. But extinction and hiding are different concepts, and you never learned the distinction. Steel rang against steel in rapid exchanges that tested every lesson her father had drilled into her during training sessions that had seemed endless. But this man was good, professionally trained, experienced in actual combat, rather than simple execution. His blade work spoke of genuine skill earned through survival, rather than purchased with family wealth. Behind them, she heard Darius testing his bonds, the sound of rope straining against supernatural strength that remained formidable despite whatever torture had weakened it. Good. If he could free himself, their escape would become infinitely more manageable. "You're too late," her opponent said, pressing an attack that forced her to give ground. "Others know of his location. Killing us changes nothing." "Perhaps," Moira admitted, her scarred left hand finding a camp stool that she hurled at his head. "But it will feel considerably better than letting you live." The distraction created opening she needed. Silver steel, finding the gap beneath his raised arm where expensive armor offered insufficient protection. He fell with surprise still written across features that would never again discuss other people's suffering with such casual authority, but victory carried immediate price. Outside, voices rose in alarm as patrol discovered the bodies she had left scattered across their perimeter. Boots hammered earth as soldiers responded to crisis with professional efficiency that spoke of genuine military training. Moira. Darius's voice carried pain and something deeper, recognition of sacrifice she was making by revealing herself so completely. You shouldn't have come. Probably not, she agreed, sawing through his bonds with movements made urgent by approaching chaos. But MacLeods have never been known for sensible decision-making. His ropes parted, freeing hands that immediately sought her face with desperate tenderness. For one stolen moment, they existed in space between heartbeats where neither enemies nor consequences could touch them. Then reality crashed back as torchlight blazed outside the tent, as voices coordinated search patterns that would find them within minutes. Escape routes that had seemed manageable for single infiltrator became death traps when burdened with wounded prisoner, whose condition she could now properly assess. Darius had endured considerable torture, burns along his arms that spoke of heated metal, bruises that suggested systematic beating, cuts that had been precisely placed to maximize pain without causing fatal blood loss. He could move, could fight if necessary, but not with the fluid grace that normally characterized supernatural royalty. "Can you run?" she asked, already knowing the answer from the way he favored his left side. "If necessary." His smile carried echoes of the man who had once burned her world, before guilt and time had transformed him into something worth saving. Though I suspect running won't be sufficient. Through the tent walls, she could see torches moving in coordinated patterns that spoke of professional soldiers conducting proper search. No chaos, no panic, just methodical examination that would inevitably lead to their discovery. 30 men, at least, armed and armored, positioned between them and any reasonable escape route. Even at full strength, those odds would challenge supernatural capabilities. With Darius wounded and herself committed to protecting, rather than simply killing, the mathematics became impossible. Unless she gave them something else to focus on. Unless the last MacLeod provided distraction that would let wounded King reach safety, while she faced consequences alone. "There's a path," she said quietly, describing the route that had brought her here. "Raven's Road. Your horse is waiting above the cliff." "Our horse," he corrected, understanding flooding his expression as he recognized what she was contemplating. "No." Her voice carried finality that brooked no argument. "Some debts can only be paid one way, and this is mine to settle." Outside, the search pattern tightened like noose around condemned prisoners. Time measured itself in heartbeats that brought discovery closer with each passing moment. The sacrifice demanded everything, but some prices were worth paying when love finally found its proper name. "The resolution." "No," Darius said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded kingdoms. "I won't let you." His words died as Moira's scarred hand covered his mouth, her eyes fierce with purpose that brooked no argument. Outside, the torches drew closer, their methodical pattern promising discovery within heartbeats. "Listen," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "You are a king. Your people need you alive more than they need my conscience clean." Her fingers traced the burn scars along his arms, evidence of what his captivity had cost. "But if we're both going to survive this, I need you to trust the MacLeod in me one more time." The search voices were close enough now to distinguish individual words, orders given with military precision, acknowledgments that spoke of soldiers who knew their business. Professional killers closing their net around prey they believed helpless. They had never hunted a MacLeod before. Moira moved to the tent's entrance, her inherited blades catching torchlight as she tested their balance. "When I give the signal, you run for Raven's Road. Don't look back, don't hesitate, don't try to help. Just survive, Moira. Promise me." Her voice carried desperation that transformed command into plea. "Promise me that if this goes wrong, you'll remember that I chose it. That this was my decision, not your failure." Before he could answer, she stepped through the tent flap into chaos that had been waiting for her arrival. The camp erupted as 20 soldiers converged on the command area, torches blazing like fallen stars against the pre-dawn darkness. But instead of the cornered prey they expected, they found a MacLeod daughter standing over their dead commanders, silver steel gleaming with promises of violence that had been honed across 3 centuries of clan warfare. "I am Moira MacLeod," she announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent camp. "Last daughter of the bloodline your masters tried to extinguish. Come and finish what you started." The first wave broke against her like water against stone. Her dirk found throats with surgical precision, while her Stian Du opened arteries that painted the ground with consequences of miscalculation. These were good soldiers, professionally trained, but they had never faced an enemy who moved like liquid death given human form. Behind her, she heard Darius moving, not toward the escape route she had provided, but deeper into the camp where their horses waited. Relief flooded through her even as she parried a thrust that would have opened her ribs. He was alive, he was mobile, and he was smart enough to recognize tactical necessity, even when it carved pieces from his heart. The second wave coordinated better, attacking from multiple angles that forced her to give ground. Steel rang against silver as inherited weapons met professionally maintained equipment in exchanges that tested every lesson her father had burned into her during training sessions that had seemed endless. But she was fighting for time now, rather than victory, each parried blow and dodged thrust buying precious seconds for a wounded king to reach safety. The mathematics were clear. She could hold them, but not forever. Eventually numbers would tell, and then the last MacLeod would join her family in whatever darkness waited beyond breathing. A blade slipped past her guard, opening a line of fire across her ribs that reminded her that even supernatural heritage had limitations. Another found the gap between her leather bracers, painting her forearms with blood that looked black in the torchlight. But still she fought, because MacLeods had never learned how to surrender, and because somewhere in the darkness behind her, a man who had once burned her world was running toward survival that would let him become worthy of the crown he wore. The third wave should have ended it. Coordinated spear thrusts from 4 directions that no single fighter could counter. She prepared to meet them with the fierce joy that had sustained her bloodline through 3 centuries of impossible odds. Instead, she heard the thunder of hoofbeats as Darius exploded back into the battle astride a warhorse that scattered soldiers like leaves before autumn wind. His sword, somehow recovered from his captors, carved through enemy ranks with the fluid grace that marked supernatural royalty at its finest. "Did you really think," he said, extending his hand toward her while his blade held a dozen enemies at bay, "that I would abandon the woman who risked everything to save me?" Moira grasped his offered hand, feeling supernatural strength lift her onto the horse behind him as steel sang its deadly song around them. "I told you to run," she gasped, her arms encircling his waist as they wheeled toward the camp's perimeter. "And I told you," he replied, spurring their mount toward freedom that suddenly seemed possible again. "That MacLeods have never been known for sensible decision-making. It appears to be contagious." Behind them, the camp erupted in futile pursuit as supernatural speed carried them beyond reach of merely human vengeance. But ahead lay questions that would prove far more dangerous than any army. Questions about forgiveness, about redemption, and about whether love could truly bloom from ashes of betrayal. The immediate battle was won. The war for their souls had only begun. The return. The first light of dawn touched the ancient stones of Castle Ravencrest as their exhausted mount crested the final hill. Both horse and riders bearing wounds that spoke of battles barely survived. Below them, the stronghold that had sheltered Moira for 7 years. As servant now awaited her return, as something altogether different. A woman who had walked through fire and emerged transformed. Darius swayed in the saddle, his injuries finally claiming the strength that supernatural will had sustained through their desperate flight. Moira steadied him, her scarred hands sure and gentle, as they guided their mount through gates that seemed smaller than memory suggested. Everything appeared diminished somehow, as if the world had contracted during her absence. Or perhaps she had simply grown too large for the spaces that had once contained her. The courtyard erupted as their arrival registered. Servants streaming from doorways, guards rushing to assist their wounded king, voices raised in relief and celebration that the Alpha had returned alive. But Moira felt their eyes upon her too, saw recognition dawning as they processed the impossible sight of their former kitchen maid seated behind royalty like an equal. "My lord," Captain Aldrich reached them first, his weathered face tight with concern as he took in Darius's condition. "The healers, we must get you to the healers immediately." "In moment." Darius's voice carried the authority that had never truly left him, even during captivity. "First, there are things that must be said." He turned in the saddle to face Moira, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, not gratitude or relief, but recognition of a truth that would change everything. "Help me down," he said quietly. "What happens next, I must do standing." She slid from the horse first, then steadied him as he dismounted with careful grace. Around them, a crowd had gathered. Not just servants and guards, but nobility who had apparently rushed from their breakfast upon hearing of the king's return. Among them, she glimpsed Luna Queen Evangeline, her former mistress's face a study in confusion, as she tried to reconcile the blood-stained warrior before her with the quiet girl who had once braided her hair. 7 years ago, Darius said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "I made a mistake that cost innocent lives. I destroyed a family based on fear and ignorance, believing them enemies when they were protectors." His gaze never left Moira's face. "I have spent every day since learning to live with that guilt." Whispers rippled through the assembled crowd like wind through grain. Moira felt the weight of their attention, the pressure of secrets finally exposed to light that would judge them all. "But yesterday," the king continued, "that family's last daughter risked everything to save the life of the man who destroyed hers. She walked into enemy hands with nothing but inherited steel and a courage that puts my royal bloodline to shame." He moved closer until only she could hear his next words. "Tell me how to make amends for crimes that can never be undone." Moira looked into the eyes of the man who had been her nightmare and her salvation both, seeing past the king to the person beneath, flawed, guilt-ridden, but genuinely seeking redemption that might heal them both. Around them, the courtyard held its breath, waiting for words that would either damn them all or set them free. "You already have," she said quietly, "by becoming worthy of forgiveness you never demanded." Her scarred hand found his, fingers intertwining without shame or hesitation. "By proving that people can change, that love can grow in ground that once knew only hate." The crowd's collective gasp seemed to echo off stone walls as implications registered, their king holding hands with a former servant, their sovereign claiming responsibility for ancient crimes, the careful hierarchy that had governed their world for generations, suddenly revealed as fragile as morning mist. But Evangeline stepped forward then, her face bright with understanding rather than condemnation. "Moira," she said, using the same gentle tone that had characterized their years together. "You saved us all, didn't you? During the rogue attack, that skill you showed was real. It was always real, my lady." Moira's voice carried new confidence, the self-assurance of someone who had stopped hiding from her own identity. "I am the last of the MacLeod bloodline, trained from childhood to protect this land and its people. Even when I believed that purpose lost, it remained part of who I was." "Then you'll stay?" The question came from Darius, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "As yourself this time, not as someone else's shadow?" Moira looked around the courtyard that had witnessed her transformation. From broken refugee to servant to the woman she had been meant to become all along. These people needed protection, needed someone who understood that strength came not from avoiding pain, but from surviving it. That healing was possible even when scars remained forever. "I'll stay," she said, her voice carrying across stone walls that had sheltered her when she needed sanctuary, and now welcomed her home as something new. But not as I was. She had returned, but she would never be the same again. The new beginning. 6 months later, Moira stood in the castle's great hall, watching sunlight stream through windows that caught the silver threads woven into her dark green gown, the MacLeod tartan, recreated from memory and worn openly for the first time since childhood. The fabric moved differently than the servant's rough wool she had worn for 7 years, but she had grown comfortable with the weight of her heritage made visible. "The border patrol's report all quiet, my lady," Captain Aldrich said, approaching with the deference he now showed the woman who had become the castle's official protector. "Your training methods have made remarkable improvements to their effectiveness. Moira nodded, accepting the report with the same gravity she had once reserved for managing Luna Evangeline's correspondence. The role of guardian, a position created specifically for her unique skills and heritage, fit her like inherited armor. She was no longer hiding behind another woman's shadow, but she had not forgotten the lessons those years of service had taught about duty and sacrifice. "And the king?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Darius's morning routine had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Training with the new recruits in the lower courtyard, Aldrich replied with the hint of a smile. He seems determined to ensure they can defend themselves without requiring rescue. Through the tall windows, Moira could indeed see Darius moving through sword forms with the fluid grace that marked supernatural royalty, his students struggling to match techniques that had been refined across centuries. The torture scars had healed, leaving only faint lines that spoke of survival rather than defeat. He had grown stronger in the months since their return, not just physically, but in ways that mattered more. They both had. "Moira?" Evangeline's voice carried the same gentle warmth it always had, though their relationship had evolved into something resembling friendship between equals rather than mistress and servant. "The delegation from the northern clans has arrived. They're asking to meet with you." The political landscape had shifted considerably since word spread that the MacLeod bloodline survived, that ancient protectors once again walked the Scottish Highlands. Clans that had forgotten old alliances now sought to renew them. Young wolves who had never heard the old stories came seeking training and skills their grandparents had thought lost forever. "What do they want?" Moira asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Same thing they all want," Evangeline replied with gentle amusement. "To see the last MacLeod with their own eyes, to know that legends can become flesh and blood again." Moira had grown accustomed to such visits, though she remained uncomfortable with the way some spoke of her, as if survival itself had transformed her into something more than human. She was still the broken girl who had arrived at Castle Ravencrest with burns that would never fully heal. But she was also the woman who had reclaimed her father's legacy, who had chosen love over vengeance, who had learned that strength could be built from scars instead of hidden beneath them. "Tell them I'll see them after the evening meal," she said. "But make it clear that MacLeod hospitality comes with expectations. If they want our protection, they must be worthy of it." As Evangeline departed to deliver the message, Moira moved to the window that overlooked the training yard. Below, Darius called a halt to the session, his students dispersing with the grateful exhaustion that marked effective instruction. He looked up, as if sensing her observation, and smiled with the warmth that had replaced the careful distance they had once maintained. He climbed the stairs to join her, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had learned to live with his past without being defined by it. When he reached her side, his arms encircled her waist with familiar tenderness, and she leaned into the strength that had become her anchor. "The northern delegation?" he asked, having observed their arrival with the same attention to detail that had kept him alive through decades of political maneuvering. "Seeking alliance," she confirmed, her hands covering his, as if the MacLeod name could somehow protect them from challenges they must face themselves. "Perhaps it can," Darius suggested quietly, "not through magic or ancient power, but through example, through proof that broken things can be made whole, that enemies can become allies, that love can bloom even from ashes of betrayal." Moira turned in his arms, seeing past the king to the man who had traveled the hardest road of all, from destroyer to protector, from guilt to redemption. His scars were different from hers, invisible but equally permanent, and equally beautiful in their way. "Is that what we are?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Proof that healing is possible?" "We are many things," he replied, his forehead touching hers in the gesture that had become their most intimate connection. "But yes, we are proof that love can transcend blood, that forgiveness can transform everything it touches, that new beginnings are possible even when the past seems insurmountable." Outside the windows, the sun set behind mountain peaks that had witnessed centuries of MacLeod guardianship. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors seeking ancient wisdom, new opportunities to prove that legends could indeed walk among mortals once again. But tonight, in the castle that had sheltered her when she was broken and now celebrated her wholeness, Moira MacLeod stood in the arms of the man who had learned that true strength came not from avoiding consequences, but from facing them with grace. The last MacLeod had come home, and in doing so, she had shown them all what redemption truly looked like.